Hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you again for joining me for our next class in Exodus, and it is an auspicious day because if I am correct, and I'm confident that we're going to be able to do this, we're going to get through to the end of the book of Exodus. Because last time we looked at chapter 32, and that was the golden calf incident and the fallout from that, and we're still going to be dealing with the fallout from that. But we are going to make it all the way to chapter 40 because a lot of the chapters in between just have to do with Israel building the tabernacle, and the wording is pretty much, the description is pretty much exactly the same as what we saw before with how they were supposed to make the tabernacle, the directions for it. So we're going to be able to get through this pretty quickly. So let's start with where we left off. Verse 1 of chapter 33. So we are in Exodus 33. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Depart and go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it, and I will send my angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanite, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." So the Lord says it's time to start heading out. He says, "I will send my angel before you." Remember, the word angel doesn't only mean messenger, it can also mean representative, or it can even mean representation in some circumstances. But, one thing, the relationship here is going to be a strained one. God says, "I will not go up in your midst, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." The idea is God's and this would have been understood by them. The idea is that God is holy, and because they are unfaithful to Him, they've made themselves unholy. And so if God were to dwell among them, His holiness would consume them. And that's actually, I'm going to say this at the end of the class too, but that's actually what Leviticus deals about. Almost in its entirety. How to safely approach God, who is holy, when you are a human who is unholy and unclean and such. So, if the Lord were to be among them now, He would end up consuming them along the way. I said that this is the sort of thing that Leviticus is going to deal with, but really, the rest of the Bible deals with this idea as well. How can human beings dwell once more among God? Like the book of Hebrews quotes from Jeremiah that God says that He would be among His people of His new covenant, and they would be His people, and He would be their God. But if He can't dwell among them, lest His holiness consume them, then there's a very big problem. So the big question is, how can we get it so that people can dwell along with the holy God in the same place, without the people being consumed? And so verse 4, when the people heard this bad news, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the children of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people. I could come up into your midst in one moment and consume you. Now therefore take off your ornaments, so that I will know what to do with you." So the children of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments by Mount Horeb. And their ornaments are the jewelry and such, the fancy things. The people mourn and the Lord commands them that they are not to put on their ornaments, anything that is jewelry, the things that you would braid into your hair, or whatever it be, things to make yourself look fancy. Those are the ornaments. Instead, they are to mourn, and they humbly submit themselves to the Lord's judgment, which is exactly what he wanted from them all along. This idea is reminiscent of James chapter 4. Let me turn there for a moment. James chapter 4, starting in verse 4, where it says, "Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace, therefore, he says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Therefore, submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up." The idea is that instead of continue on in one's stiff-necked, stubborn, and proud ways, you take the other road, and you lament, you mourn, you express your being sorry for doing what offends God, and when you humble yourself before God, he ends up lifting you up. He lifts up, he exalts the humble, but the proud he is against, and he puts them down. And so that is exactly what Israel does when they hear this bad news. Verse 7 picks up. "So Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, far from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of meeting." This is not the tabernacle. This is a different one. The tabernacle or tent of meeting. "And it came to pass that everyone who sought the Lord went out to the tabernacle of meeting, which was outside the camp." So this was a regular practice. "So it was, whenever Moses went out to the tent, that all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent door and watched Moses until he had gone into the tent. And it came to pass, when Moses entered the tent, that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tent, and the Lord talked with Moses." So Moses would go into the tent, and then God would appear in the cloud at the entrance of that tent. "All the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tent door, and all the people rose and worshipped, each man in his tent door. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. And he would return to the camp, but his servant, or his assistant, Joshua the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tent." So Joshua would hang out in the tent for a time after the meeting was over. So the tent of meeting is this place where Moses, of course, meets with God, and that's a very important thing to remember by the time we get to the end of the book of Exodus. And the Lord would, quote, "speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend." Abraham is not the only person in the Bible who is called a friend of God. Moses speaks with the Lord, or at least the Lord speaks to Moses, like a man speaking to his friend. Later in the book of Numbers, when Miriam and Aaron try to put themselves on the same level as Moses, God speaks to them and points out, hey, I talk to you guys in signs and dreams, dark visions and riddles that take some postulating, some pondering to figure out, and they're all very vague. But this guy Moses, I speak to him face to face. I speak to him plainly. He has this special relationship with God. So that he's obviously on sort of a different a different level than all the other people who were prophets of God in Israel. So, going on from there, verse 12, then Moses said to the Lord, see, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, and that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation also is your people. And God said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And he said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not bring us out of here. You catch that? If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up out of here. Moses does not want to go on without knowing that the Lord is with them, and also with him, specifically with Moses. Moses has already experienced the stresses of having to take care of this people in the wilderness, when really it was God who was taking care of them. He does not want to, and he's already considered, had to think about the idea of just him going on, because remember when the golden calf incident happened, God said, hey, I'm going to destroy everybody else in Israel and I'll start over with you, Moses. Moses had to really think about what it would mean for him to be the one person who would go on. He would have to be all alone. Moses doesn't want that, and he doesn't want to go on without knowing that God is with him. Consider the context. This is just after the golden calf incident, where Israel commits their first offense against the covenant. And so Moses doesn't really know if they have, permanently messed things up or not. He does not really know. And so God promising that his presence will go with him is a really big thing. And fortunately, God puts him at ease. Verse 17, he says, I will also do this thing that you have spoken, for you have found grace in my sight, and I know you by name. So Moses is put at ease when God sort of reinforces his promise that, yes, my presence will go with you. And this, remember, God had already said, I'm not going with you because I would consume you. He was about to send them off by themselves to go through the wilderness and arrive at the promised land. He said, I will not go with you because I would consume you. Now Moses is saying, please don't just send us away. Please come with us. And if you will not come with us, then just let us remain here. So God is, you ever think about the times when, Aaron or Abraham or Moses changed God's mind? Well, there's been discussion over whether or not they actually had a chance of changing God's mind. Does it sound like he's trying to change God's mind here? Yes, it does. Because God was about to send them by themselves, not by themselves, his angel would lead them, but he was about to send them without going with them. But Moses says, don't send us away without your presence. Have your presence go with us, and if not, just don't send us away. We don't want to leave your presence. Which is why God has to implement a way for his presence to dwell with them without consuming them. And that's what the book of Leviticus, like I said before, is about. So the Lord promises to be with them, so it lets Moses know things can be okay. The Lord will go with them. So then in verse 18 it carries on. Moses said, please show me your glory. Show me your glory. Then he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you. This is God speaking. And I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live. We talked about this part a few weeks ago when we talked about chapter, I think, 24. So we don't really have to go into detail too much about it. But the Lord said, verse 21, here is a place by me, and you shall stand on the rock. So it shall be when my glory passes by that I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you up with my hand while I pass by. And then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back. But my face you will not see. So, Moses has asked to see the Lord's glory. Like I said, we talked about this previously. The Lord says, you cannot see my face. You'll die if you see my face. But you can hide away in the cleft of this rock, and I'll cover you up with my hand, and then I'll pass by, and I'll take my hand away, and you can see at least my back. My back won't kill you. Now, this is a textbook example of what is called anthropomorphization. Anthro meaning human, morphization meaning giving a form to. So giving the form of a human to that which does not possess the form of a human. So does God have a literal face? No. Does God have a literal hand or a literal back? No. What is God? God is spirit, right? John 4:24. God does not have a literal face, hand, or back. He also doesn't have literal feet or literal arms, as elsewhere mentioned in the Bible. What is this about? It is anthropomorphization. It is giving human characteristics to a non-human thing or being to help us, who are humans, better understand what is being talked about. So we better understand God and the things going on with Him by giving Him some human characteristics. So God's face is sort of like full-on seeing everything about Him. It would kill a person. But seeing His back is more like seeing something of a lesser degree of His gloriousness. It won't kill you. And His hand, I guess, being sort of so we can understand that He's watching out for us. He's going to cover us with His hand, so that covers Moses with that hand, covers him with that protective side of him, so that Moses does not drop dead from seeing the full-on glory of God. I would figure that if you had to pick a way to go, if you had to pick a way to go to, I don't know what would happen. Would you like burn up? I don't know. Just seeing the full-on glory of God. What a way to go. But Moses doesn't go that way. God doesn't let him see his face, and therefore he does not die. So then, picking up in chapter 34, the Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 tablets of stone like the first ones, and I will write on these tablets the words that were on the first tablets which you broke. So be ready in the morning, and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai, and present yourself to me there on the top of the mountain. And no man shall come up with you, and let no man be seen throughout all the mountain. Let neither flocks nor herds feed before the mountain." So he cut 2 tablets of stone, like the first ones. And then Moses rose early in the morning and went up Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him. And he took in his hands the 2 tablets of stone. You remember the first tablets? Moses threw them on the ground and broke them. Not a great move. Now God has told him, cut 2 tablets that were like the first ones and bring them back up, and I will write it all again. Keep this in mind. Note this. The first tablets were cut out by God. The Bible remarked that they were the workmanship, the work of God, and the writing of God. This time, God does not cut the tablets out of the rock that is there. He does not make them himself. He tells Moses to make them. Human hands are making this second set of tablets. So the Lord passed before him. Sorry, I skipped a verse. Verse 5. Now the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Behold the kindness and severity of God. Verse 8, so Moses made haste and bowed his head towards the earth and worshipped. Then he said, if now I have found grace in your sight, O Lord, let my Lord, I pray, go among us, even though we are a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. So the Lord has Moses cut these two new tablets, like the first one, and God he's going to sort of renew the covenant. This is from verses 10 through 26. He sort of restates a lot of the basis of the covenant, and it's probably as a way of showing to Israel that he's committed to making this covenant relationship work, that even though they have wronged him, proven unfaithful, he has decided to make it work and forgive them and dwell with them again, instead of dropping them for offending him the way that they did. So Moses writes on these new stone tablets, or maybe did Moses write on them, or did God write on them? I cannot see the exact verse where it says that. But the new tablets are written. And he comes down from the mountain. Verse 29, now it was so when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hands when he came down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face was shining while he talked with him. So, being exposed to God's glory apparently changed Moses' appearance. It made his face start shining. And so, when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to come close to him. Then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. Afterward, all the children of Israel came near, and he gave them as commandments all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off until he came out. And he would come out and speak to the children of Israel whatever he had commanded. And when the children of Israel saw the face of Moses, and the skin of Moses' face was shining, then Moses would put the veil on his face again until he would go in again to speak to him. So you get this imagery. We have Moses who goes in to speak with the Lord. He's got this veil on because his face is shining. And so whenever he goes in to speak to the Lord again, he takes the veil off. Because obviously, you don't need to put the veil back on when you're speaking to the Lord, whose presence is the thing that makes your face shine. Just be a little silly to keep the veil on when your face is going to shine anyway. And so he comes back out, veil still off, face still shining, tells them whatever God had said to them, and then puts the veil back on. So whenever Israel is receiving these commandments from God through Moses, they are seeing God's glory sort of reflected off of Moses' face. I didn't know that that was part of this whole deal when I was younger. I know I'm still young, but when I was younger and learning about this for the first time, I didn't know that that was the dynamic going on. That Moses had a shining face whenever he came out of the tent of meeting and told them what God had said. He kept the veil off while speaking to them, and then when he was done, he put it back on, sort of saying, okay, veil is off, I'm speaking as a prophet of God, put the veil back on, okay, we are just being normal operations here. Kind of interesting. I didn't know about that. There's just some kind of relationship between God's glory and shining light. Have you ever realized that? Have you ever noticed that light is connected to, of course you realize it because it's all over the Bible, but light being connected to God and dark being connected to the absence of God. The first thing God made was what? It was light. So light is of course tied to God's glory because it was the first thing to be made by him, and it is in contrast to dark, which is symbolically the absence of God's glory, because complete darkness is the absence of the first thing that God created. A cool symbolism. Okay, so like I said before, the next 5 chapters are about Israel doing all of the things that God had commanded in as far as the tabernacle and the priestly garments are concerned. The manner in which they make them is almost word for word as when it was commanded, so we're not going to read those again. The main thing to notice, however, is how after everything gets made, everything that was included in the tabernacle is counted as one item when we're talking about this in particular. But it is remarked that they did, quote, as the Lord commanded Moses. You can find this in chapter 38, verse 22, and in chapter 39, verses 1, 5, 7, 21, 26, and 31. It is 7 times, because of course it is 7 times. 7 times in the listing of all these things that they make, that it remarks they did as the Lord had commanded Moses. They did just what the Lord commanded Moses, which is important. They're doing it, you could say, perfectly, and they're doing it as per the divine pattern that was given to them. And of course, the number 7, the reason why it says it 7 times is important as well, because the number 7 is the number for perfection and divine perfection. God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. 7 days. The Sabbath day was supposed to be the day where Israel is done with their working for the week, and then their working is complete, and so they can stop on the 7th day. The 7th year was when the slaves were done working for whichever masters they were working for, and so they were to stop being slaves. They were to be free. And 7 times 7 years is when all the land in Israel that had been bought and sold went back to the original families that owned it, which is really crazy of an economic thing to do, but God is into those crazy radical things, I guess. The number 7 is really important when talking about perfection and divine perfection and holiness. And so it's mentioned 7 times in the listing of all these things that Israel makes as per the instructions. Said 7 times that they did it as the Lord commanded Moses. And so when we get to chapter 40, the tabernacle is finally finished, and they set it up. And Moses, ceremonially washes Aaron and his sons, and he consecrates them as priests. But there's a problem. There's a problem. Exodus chapter 40, verses 34 and 35. The problem is this. Then the cloud, that's God's cloud, the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tent. And Moses was not able to enter the tabernacle of meeting, because the cloud rested above it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tent. Problem. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord fills it. But now Moses can't go into the tent of meeting. And if he can't go into the tent of meeting, he's got nowhere that he can go to meet with God anymore. What? Big problem. It's to be understood that this is a matter of God's holiness. So the question becomes, how does one become holy so that the people can still meet with God? Because if they are to live according to God's will and according to God's law, they're going to have to be able to go to Him. And if they're going to keep the sacrificial system, they're going to have to be able to go before God as well. So how do people become holy so that they can still meet with God? Now that Moses is barred from entering the tabernacle of meeting, which up till this point has been how he interacts with God, how are we going to interact with God now? We need to figure out a way. And of course, Israel, they don't figure out a way, but they are given a way, and that is what Leviticus is actually going to be about. It starts with the sacrificial systems, especially the burnt offering, which is making peace between you and God when you have sinned. And there are many other things, how to keep yourself ceremonially clean, and how to make yourself clean again once you become unclean. Now, when we start reading Leviticus, we're going to start reading Leviticus, so bear with me. When we start reading Leviticus, we need to understand that it's not a sin in Leviticus to be unclean. Like, it's not a sin to touch a dead body. Otherwise, how would you bury your relatives, right? But it is a bad thing to be unclean and waltz into the presence of the holy God. Because in Leviticus 10, we have instances of people actually doing that, and they die. They die because they weren't treating God as holy. God says, I am holy, and anyone who comes before me must treat me as holy. God is holy. And so coming before Him in an unfit state, being unclean, is you're walking into your death. Like He said, I would consume you if I were among you. Why? Because Israel at that point had, essentially, you could say they have broken the rules. God gave them the commandments, and they transgressed against them. They made themselves unholy, so God is going to give them a way to be holy again. And once we get through Leviticus, we're going to see that it works. And now God and Israel are going to dwell in the same place, with God in the tabernacle and Israel all around it. And then they can pack up shop and start moving on with God in their midst. And it's great. Okay, so like I said, we were going to get through to the end of Exodus, but I want to give a little bit of an outro for the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is traditionally, if you were a Hebrew child, it is the first book that you would learn how to read. Not Genesis, but Exodus. Why? Because it is the, how do I say it? It is the closer one of the books. I don't know if that makes sense. You would go to Exodus to find how God took Israel out of Egypt and made them a nation, how he gave them the terms of the covenant, that is, how the Israelite people entered into this covenant in the first place. It tells just Genesis tells things in a broader sense. In the beginning, it tells the story of all of mankind and how that relates to the rest of the Bible, and then the foundational story of the Israelite nation. But Exodus is the moment where Israel becomes Israel, if that makes sense. When God really makes them into the nation of Israel, and that's why that's the first book that they would read. Moses almost definitely wrote Exodus later in his life, and so it is a very important thing to keep in mind when considering what Exodus was for. It was for telling the nation of Israel what had gotten them to the point at which they now were. Now, at the later point of Moses' life, he's in the plains of Moab. That's around Deuteronomy. So, to tell them all the things that happened to get them to the point that they were then at, Exodus is a huge, huge part of it. Genesis is the foundational story, but Exodus is when it picks up and starts talking specifically about the nation of Israel, and specifically talking about their relationship with God, and Numbers is going to talk about that as well in the time of the wilderness wanderings. And really, I think the book of Numbers should be called the book of wanderings. That would be a cool name. Anyway, I digress. But that's why Exodus is so important, and that's why, and that's the context behind it, and how that influences how we're supposed to look at it. Exodus was about telling Israel all that has brought them up to the point at which they were, and how they need to recognize a couple of things. They need to keep a couple of things in mind, because you remember, the generation in the latter part of Moses' life is not the same generation that went through the events of the Exodus. That's their parents that did that, that went through that. So Moses is trying to instill in them the knowledge and the understanding of a couple of very, very important things. That God is holy, that God is powerful, but also that God is committed to them as a people and as his people. And he went through a whole lot to equip them for being his people and acting like his people and living in the way that his people ought to live. He went through a whole lot to get them to that point. He struck Egypt with 10 plagues. He destroyed Pharaoh's army. He parted an entire sea for Israel to escape. He fed them in the wilderness. He gave them water in the wilderness. He granted them victory against an actual army in the wilderness. And he gave them all of these commandments, all of these instructions, so that they can live holy lives and be able to dwell among him. And how well they do that is up to them, but God is committed to this relationship. And it is a beautiful thing to consider that God is committed to his relationship with his people. All right, so that is it for the book of Exodus. If no one brings up any better ideas, we're going to continue on into the book of Leviticus. And when you get into Leviticus, I'll talk about this next week in an introduction sort of class, but that is when people who are reading the Bible from cover to cover usually get bogged down, because it is a lot of ritual and a lot of, well, you'll see if you haven't already seen. But we are going to focus on it in such a way, at such an angle, that we're not going to get necessarily bogged down. We're not going to fall into that sand trap. Instead, we're going to look at the principles behind the certain things that you find in Leviticus, and that is going to help us to make a more applicable interpretation for it. All right, like I said, that's it for the book of Exodus. I will see you next week, and I hope to see you Sunday morning, but I will at least see you here next week. Thank you for accompanying me in this journey through Exodus. It was great and enlightening and awesome. Like I always say, I hope everybody stays safe, stays healthy. Please keep those of our numbers who are sick or in the hospital or at home, stuck at home, in your prayers. God bless you all, and have a good night.